Motivations of the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was, in part, a humanitarian act by the United States. In dollars spent, it was one of the most generous acts in history. Many Americans believed it was essential to help war-ravaged Europe get back on its feet. The Marshall Plan was also an attempt to learn from past disasters. Truman, Marshall, and other U.S. leaders recognized that World War II had sprung out of the poverty and chaos sown by the post-war settlements of World War I. They believed that by reviving the world economy, they could prevent the rise of more dictators. Finally, the Marshall Plan was a shrewd maneuver by one of the Cold War superpowers. The United States hoped that the infusion of dollars would support capitalist economies, including its own, strengthen democratic governments, keep communism at bay, and build strong trading partners for U.S. businesses. The Berlin Airlift. At the end of World War II, the Soviets occupied eastern Germany, while Britain, France, and the United States occupied the western portion of the country. Just as the country of Germany was divided, so was the capital city of Berlin. The Allies partitioned Berlin into two sections: West Berlin, controlled by the three Democratic Allies, and East Berlin, controlled by the Soviets. But the city was located 200 miles inside the country's Soviet-dominated zone. As conflict mounted between the Soviets and the United States, Stalin wanted to drive the British, French, and Americans out of their half of Berlin. In June 1948, he ordered a blockade of West Berlin, refusing to let any supplies come in by road or rail. Without supplies, Berlin's people would soon face starvation. Stalin hoped that by blockading the city, he could force the United States and its allies to give up their part of Berlin, thus transforming the city into a unified capital city under Soviet control. In response, the British and Americans organized a massive airlift of food and other supplies into the beleaguered city. The Americans called the airlift Operation Victuals, while the British called it Operation Plainfare, with a pun on fare meaning food. Despite these lighthearted names, the Berlin Airlift, as the operation is generally known, was in fact a heroic act of rescue. Over the next year, more than 277,000 flights delivered some 2.3 million tons of supplies to West Berlin. At the height of the blockade, a plane touched down at the city every few minutes. Because of difficult flying conditions, 73 Allied airmen lost their lives in the course of the Berlin Airlift. In May 1949, Stalin acknowledged defeat by lifting the blockade. In the same year, Germany itself was divided into two countries. The western part became a separate, democratic nation, the Federal Republic of Germany, often called West Germany. The eastern part of Germany became the German Democratic Republic, often called East Germany, with East Berlin as its capital. Despite its name, East Germany was far from democratic. The Communist Party controlled the government, which took its directions from the Soviet Union. Okay, this is important to remember because here from 1949 up until 1989, there was going to be a East Germany and a West Germany, and that west part and on farther west would be democratic countries, and the east part of Germany and farther east would be Soviet-controlled communist countries. So this is really going to drive the Cold War for the last half of the 20th century. This is what really history of this part of this time in history. It's very much focused on Cold War relations. Okay, rebuilding Japan. As Europe revived, Japan was rebuilding as well. After the war, General Douglas MacArthur, commander of all U.S. military forces in the Pacific, became commander of the occupation forces in Japan. He used his power to transform the country from a militaristic empire to a democratic, capitalist, and peaceful nation. MacArthur started by disarming 5 million Japanese soldiers. Then he put a group of Army and Navy officers to work to create a new constitution for Japan. The new constitution set up a parliamentary government and guaranteed individual civil liberties. It gave women the vote and others' rights. Under the new constitution, Japan gave up its right to make war and maintain a military. As in Europe, the U.S. did not rebuild Japan entirely for unselfish reasons. The Cold War had reconfigured the world so quickly that the United States needed a stable, friendly Japan to stand as an ally against the spread of communism in East Asia. And here's a picture of the Berlin Airlift. Hundreds of thousands of flights delivered millions of tons of food and supplies to West Berlin during the Berlin Airlift. Cold War alliances. At its worst point, the Berlin crisis looked like it might spark a new war. But Stalin's fear of atomic bombs, which at the time only the United States had, made him back down from a fight. Truman knew the Soviets were working to build an atomic weapons, and he knew that when they succeeded, they would be less willing to back down. In preparation for that day, the president began talking with several Western European nations about forming a military alliance. In 1949, 12 Western countries, led by Britain, France, and the United States, signed an agreement establishing the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, known as NATO. The treaty, designed mainly to halt Soviet aggression, bound each nation to come to the aid of any member state that was attacked. It was the first time the United States had joined a military alliance during a time of peace. The Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc satellites eventually responded by signing their own mutual defense treaty called the Warsaw Pact. To some observers, this new system of military alliances was a frightful reminder of the alliances that European nations formed in the years leading to World War I. They wondered if the world was starting down a road toward yet another catastrophic conflict. And here we have the two flags. The one on the left is the flag of the USSR, and of course the United States flag. Cold War worlds. In less than half a century, two world wars had destroyed pre-1914 world order. With the Cold War, a new order took shape, pitting capitalism against communism, the West against the East. By the 1950s, journalists and politicians began to refer to this new order as the First World and the Second World. By the First World, they meant industrialized capitalist nations, the United States and its Western European allies. By the Second World, they meant the communist or socialist industrial states, encompassing the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc nations. There were also many developing nations that were not yet industrialized and generally had a low standard of living. Many of these so-called Third World nations were Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Many had long been colonies ruled by European nations. But after World War II, war-weary Europeans were beginning to lose their enthusiasm for ruling faraway colonies. The war had left much of Europe in ruins. The victorious nations, such as Britain and France, had sustained millions of casualties. Their government treasuries were almost broke. Their remaining armies and navies were exhausted. The old imperial powers of Europe could no longer enforce their rule of distant territories. In these overseas colonies, nationalists stirred the desire for independence. India and Pakistan gained their independence from Britain in 1947. In the late 1940s and 1950s, nationalists fought to throw off French colonial rule in Indochina, the eastern part of the long peninsula that extends from southeastern Asia into the South China Sea. France's colonial holdings became the countries of Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. From the 1950s into the 1960s, many African nations gained independence from European rule. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union began to compete for influence in Third World nations. Both countries sought to extend their spheres of influence by building economic, cultural, and military ties to the host of new countries that emerged from colonial rule. Competition for their loyalty and their resources was stiff and sometimes led to armed conflicts among forces supported by the United States or the Soviet Union, though the two superpowers never engaged in direct head-to-head conflict. In Korea, discussed later in this chapter, and in Vietnam, discussed in a later chapter, the United States deployed American troops to keep Third World nations free from Soviet influence. The campaign of 1948. When President Truman ran for re-election in 1948, his prospects did not look good. During his time in office, his domestic policies had met strong resistance from a coalition of Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats. They had hoped he might turn away from Roosevelt's New Deal policies. But when Truman called for increased Social Security payments and new public work projects, one Republican congressman accused the president of out-New Dealing the New Deal. Many Americans were unhappy with the president because they were feeling the pinch of inflation. When World War II ended, the government lifted wartime price controls on consumer goods and prices shot up. When the cost of steak leaped from 55 cents to $1 a pound, the New York Daily News headline declared, "Prices soar, buyers soar, steers jump over the moon." That's a funny headline. Although prices were rising, wages did not keep pace, which led many labor unions to strike for higher pay. When coal miners, steel workers, and railroad workers went on strike, the nation's economy suffered. The wave of strikes triggered a Republican effort to trim the power of labor. In 1947, Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act. This act took back some of what the unions had gained from the Wagner Act of 1935. The Taft-Hartley Act made it illegal for any employer to maintain a closed shop, that is, to hire only union workers. The act also required a union to give advance notice of a strike, and it empowered the federal government to interrupt any strike judged to endanger the nation's health or safety. Truman vetoed the Taft-Hartley Act, but Congress, with a majority of Republicans, overrode his veto. As 1948 election approached, hardly anyone thought Truman could stay in the White House. The override of his Taft-Hartley veto made the president appear vulnerable. Continuing economic problems made him unpopular with many voters. Moreover, he faced serious rifts within his own Democratic Party. Challenged from the left, Henry Wallace. Some Democrats, especially those in the left wing of the party, objected to Truman's tough stance against the Soviet Union. The most prominent of these dissenters was the Secretary of Commerce, Henry Wallace. A fervent New Dealer, Wallace had been vice president during FDR's third term. A strong supporter of progressive economic policies and black civil rights, Wallace was scorned by big city machine politicians and Southern Democratic leaders who combined forces to deny him renomination as vice president. In early 1946, while serving in Truman's cabinet, Wallace gave several speeches that criticized the administration's foreign policy. Wallace claimed that the give tough with Russia policy is leading us to war. In response, Truman fired him. Out of office, Wallace continued to criticize what he considered Truman's belligerent attitude toward the Soviets. When the Marshall Plan was announced, he sneered that it should be called the Marshall Plan. Truman's response, by questioning Wallace's patriotism and encouraging him to go to the country he loved so well, the Soviet Union, and to help them out against his own country if that's the way he feels. In the 1948 election, some of the most liberal Democrats turned away from the president and threw their support to Wallace. Wallace ran as candidate of the newly formed Progressive Party. The Dixiecrats. Further complicating Truman's re-election effort was the division within the Democratic Party over the issue of civil rights for African Americans, a division that threatened to fracture the Solid South. Since the end of Reconstruction in 1877, Southern voters had reliably supported Democratic candidates, but the debate over civil rights eroded this solid Southern support. In July 1948, at the Democratic National Convention, Hubert H. Humphrey, at the time the mayor of Minneapolis, started a ruckus when he declared, "The time has arrived for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadow of states' rights and walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights." Many Southern delegates who objected to the strong civil rights plank in the party's platform left the convention. This breakaway faction of Southern Democrats strongly opposed the president's support for black civil rights. Meeting in Birmingham, Alabama, these states' rights Democrats, who quickly became known as Dixiecrats, nominated Governor Strom Thurmond of South Carolina as their candidate for president. Dewey defeats Truman. Correction. Even without the indirect aid of Henry Wallace and Strom Thurmond, Truman's Republican opponent, Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York, was a formidable candidate. Dewey campaigned on a firm anti-communist platform. He appealed to voters' fatigue with the Democrats, who had been in power for 16 years. Truman aggressively took his campaign to the people on a whistle-stop train tour covering more than 20,000 miles. He dismissed Dewey, whose name, he said, rhymes with hooey. Dewey hooey. Truman gave vigorous speeches in which he attacked the Republicans as do-nothings and greedy reactionaries. Farmers and factory workers saw him as their ally, a just plain folks man from Missouri, a straight shooter they could trust. At one event, someone yelled in the crowd, "Give him hell, Harry!" and the phrase became a campaign slogan. Nevertheless, polls taken close to the election predicted that Dewey would easily win the presidency. A Republican-leaning newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, felt so confident that before the final election results were in, it published a front-page headline declaring, "Dewey defeats Truman." When it became clear that Truman had won an upset victory, the re-elected president posed with a triumphant grin, lifting a copy of the newspaper with this mistaken headline. And there's that picture right there. President Truman holding the paper that incorrectly stated Dewey defeats Truman. Truman's Fair Deal. After a surprise victory, Truman tried to push for passage of more reforms in the spirit of the New Deal. In his January 1949 State of the Union address to Congress, the president said, "Every segment of our population and every individual has a right to expect from his government a fair deal." In his Fair Deal proposals, Truman pressed for jobs and housing for the poor and working class, more funding for education, fair hiring practices for minorities, broader Social Security coverage, a higher minimum wage, and a national health insurance program.